à-bas-le-ciel.
All of us walk past the same spectacle of, dismembered animal corpses at the grocery store every day or at the market. We all see the animals going off to the slaughterhouse in the same trucks. We're all really presented with the same stimuli, The question is there to be asked, and it's well known. Most children ask these questions, whether it's about going fishing or hunting or just seeing a lobster being chopped up on a plate. I mean, sooner or later, it becomes self-evident to all of us in childhood or adulthood, this is a living animal being chopped up. That whole process, economically, ecologically, and culturally, there's something there that will stop you from looking at all that as evil, as error, as something that for hundreds of years has gone unchallenged and even celebrated. And now we have to jettison as, unwanted baggage. I think it's really important to discard the sense of our own specialness, to not regard ourselves as the exception, but to question why it is that the people we've known, deeply and over the long term, what is it about them that's exceptional, that lets them not see this, that lets them never acknowledge it or never respond to it, either with this inevitable, inexorable set of questions or this one simple answer, that this is an evil you can extricate yourself from, that this is an evil you don't have to compromise with.
À-bas-le-ciel.
It popped into my head now while I was in the shower to make a video examining not so much why I did become vegan, but why my own parents didn't. And the more I thought about it, I thought this is really a deep and interesting subject for myself and other vegans on YouTube to examine. Of course, inevitably, if you give an honest answer, it's going to reflect the idiosyncrasies. Keep rolling. No edits. No take two. The idiosyncrasies of who your own parents happen to be. But it's also going to reveal some general, if not quite universal, trends, questions, and tendencies in the culture of our time. I mean, we're partly talking about a generation gap, yes, but I think we're partly also talking about political, cultural, even personal factors as to why it is that for some of us it seems almost inevitable and inexorable that we become vegan and can't quit. And for others, it's either unthinkable or inconceivable or something they can just barely imagine on the edges of what's possible, but that they could never really commit to. And I think I speak for the majority of us. The vast majority of vegans have to deal with an unbridgeable gulf between themselves and their parents. Sometimes, if you've married unwisely, you may have to deal with a similar gulf between you and your partner also. For my own parents, I genuinely think the single most important factor here is what we would call in political science statism. A very deep and unquestioned assumption that if this were important, the government would have already done something about it. Now, I just recently talked to my mom about this, and I pushed her a little bit on the fact that my parents, even though they were kind of dissidents within Canadian politics, they had this really deep, unshakable faith that whatever the Canadian school board was doing, whatever the Canadian school system was teaching me, was completely adequate, and there's nothing that they as parents could possibly have to add to it. I think my parents are really an extreme example of this. I pointed out in separate conversations about my mother and my father, never once did they help me write an essay. Never once did they even check or proofread an essay. Never once did they go to the library with me. Never once did they teach me how to research an essay. Never once did they help me prepare for or study for a test. They had absolutely zero scrutiny of what I was learning, and absolutely zero positive engagement. Now, of course, you could just interpret that as neglect. And yes, there's an objective sense in which it's true. They were just neglectful parents that just didn't give a damn. But on a deeper level, it really was built on this foundation of faith in the government. That they just absolutely believed that whatever the government was teaching me was adequate, and that there were no questions to be asked. There were no problems for the parents to solve, and there was no positive role for the parents to solve. And in all my years of talking to them about, say, ecological issues, you had to deal with that same faith. It really kind of precluded these questions even being asked. Like, if there were a polluted river, they believed the government would have done something about it by now. If there were something unsafe about slaughterhouse conditions, in terms of meat poisoning, if there were a problem with drinking water, if there were a problem with air pollution, the government would have done something about it by now. Now, in a country like Canada, Canada is a wealthy but medium-sized country, deeply in debt. We're constantly closing down social services and schools and hospitals. You get a lot of reminders about just how creaky and imperfect the infrastructure of government is. Again, you might ask, well, how is it possible for anyone to think that the government is so omnipotent? Well, I really have to reinforce here, this isn't something they really consciously and clearly, would enunciate as their own theory. It wasn't a theoretical view of the world they committed to. I think it really was a deep and unexamined assumption or belief that they live with. And again, some of you, reflecting on your own parents, may be able to see some parallels here. And of course, for some of you instead, like I can imagine maybe you have Catholic parents and their faith was specifically in the Catholic school board, not the government school board, where there's a mixture of religion or what have you. But of course, in my parents' case, it was the mixture of the belief in the state, in the government, in statism as such, and of course, the family religion really was communism. And that belief in the omnipotence of government and just ultimately the goodwill of government is, of course, very compatible with the totalitarian aspect of communism and socialism and what they entail, and the same excuses that they were making for the Soviet Union and for China. There were, no matter how many people got massacred or how many people were starving to death or how many disasters were reported in the newspaper from month to month, that they had to believe it was all for the best, or if there was a real problem, the government in question would have done something about it. So you can see there's a sense in which that even has to seep through into how they perceive the government of Canada, even if on some level they also criticize and vilify the government of Canada as capitalist, bourgeois, etc. So the second heading here, which definitely came up my whole life, I even remember talking about this with my grandmother, who was not a communist, is nationalism. And in Canada's case, especially for left-wingers in Canada, nationalism in large part coincides with anti-Americanism, right? But I have talked to Europeans about this. I've never really talked about it much with people in Asia. Many Canadians would believe, this must be going out of style just now, finally, they would immediately react to any news about food poisoning from meat or about inhumane conditions on factory farms. They would immediately react by saying, well, that happens in America, but that would never happen here. I remember talking to Swedes about this, people in Sweden who would believe that terrible things happened in the fur industry in Russia, but that somehow when you cross the border from Russia into Sweden, that nothing like this happened. Each of those countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, they all have their own struggles with the fur industry and, of course, meat industry of various kinds. But I've heard back from people in that part of Europe that this really unexamined nationalist knee-jerk delusion, it really does in a significant way preclude the possibility of becoming vegan. That as long as you have the sense, for me, I encounter it even when I talk to people who say that they only eat locally grown meat or locally raised meat, locally produced dairy. And my response to that face-to-face with them is to ask them, well, do you assume that a local hospital is superior to a hospital in the capital city? Do you think it has higher standards of hygiene, or that they have better doctors or better procedures? And they say no. So isn't it possible that a local slaughterhouse is just as bad as or worse than a slaughterhouse in the capital city? And, already you can imagine where that conversation goes. It's pretty easy to start chipping away at this certainty. But again, these aren't theories that these people subscribe to in a sort of conscious and examined way. They're really unexamined assumptions and beliefs. Again, the first being statism, a generalized belief in the government, and the second being nationalism. Even if that nationalism is primarily in a kind of negative form of people in, Northern Europe assuming that whatever's happening across the border in Russia is worse, And definitely, I remember there was this scandal. Some of you will remember it, some won't. There was in Europe the horse meat lasagna scandal. And the response to this scandal, definitely in both France and Germany, was this kind of universal chorus of people claiming, well, that sort of thing might happen in Hungary or Romania, but it would never happen here. That somehow, even though in the European Union now all those industries are integrated to an unbelievable extent, there really is kind of one national market for meat and for various forms of agricultural products, that it was unthinkable that this could happen in France. It was unthinkable that this could happen in Germany. But somehow when you cross the dotted line into these more exotic Eastern European countries, that was conceivable to them, that there would be these lower standards, whether it's of health, hygiene, or of animal suffering. So again, it's funny, but I think what I'm talking about here is the difference between people for whom approaching veganism either happened spontaneously or maybe it seemed natural or inevitable, and people for whom it seemed inconceivable. I think this is actually a major difference, in my case, between myself and my parents, but definitely it's a difference within the current generation too. Third and finally for this video, I think one of the most profound shaping influences in our lives be our assumptions about high culture, about what is refined culture, which ultimately is getting down to a concept of what is good. Even though both of my parents, worshipped a form of totalitarian communism found in Russia and China, their concept of high culture really was, of French culture and Italian culture. Both, I would say. And my father grew up in a steel mill town, Hamilton, Ontario, working class, with a single mother who literally worked in a steel factory. You can look at that in a sort of sympathetic light and say, okay, this guy grew up after World War II, in a very unsophisticated part of Canada. It's a very unsophisticated person. And from an early age, he started visiting Europe and really looking up to this culture, again, as high and refined culture without questioning why. In a very real sense, for my father, it's amazing because he did so much research, so many things that could have raised questions about this. He did research about, Indigenous people in Canada, First Nations in Canada, the history of colonialism and imperialism in Canada, whatever you want to say. There were really many, many junctures in his life in which he could have stopped and questioned this value. But I think it's fair to say he never did. And of course, his involvement with, say, Chinese communism and his travels throughout Asia and Africa, at any point, this is a piece of baggage he could have put down, but he absolutely never did. And if that is your idea of high culture, whether you're living in Italy now or Italy is a far off, distant, and exotic place to you, I think that really is a very effective mental block against you even thinking through the possibility of looking at what's on your plate, what's in your fridge, what's at the grocery store, and then what's coming down the highway from the farm and the slaughterhouse. That whole process, economically, ecologically, and culturally, there's something there that will stop you from looking at all that as evil, as error, as something that for hundreds of years has gone unchallenged and even celebrated, and now we have to jettison as unwanted baggage, to recycle the image, as a regrettable and even awful part of our culture and civilization. I think that's a corner he never could turn. That's something that remained unthinkable for him. And we can't make excuses here. My father enrolled to do a PhD, and he started doing a PhD. He got a full scholarship to do a PhD on Hinduism as a religion. And I remember asking about this. This is when I was a child. Well, okay. I guess I wasn't a child. I guess I would have been in university. Sorry. A long, long time ago. I remember asking him directly, well, look, if you were involved with Hinduism to this extent, why didn't you consider becoming vegetarian at that juncture? And he answered simply. He sort of had a pause, and he looked at me and he said, well, you can't be very serious about Hinduism without becoming vegetarian. He seemed to be kind of conceding the point. But again, someone who studied history and culture of India, he started learning Sanskrit and flunked out of it. China, all these other influences for him to choose between. he could have let go of this appraisal of French and Italian culture. He could have at least started to take on a more critical, comparative awareness that the different cultures had different advantages and disadvantages. But it's fair to say he absolutely never did. Okay, guys. So this is an unusual video because I'm really going to encourage you guys to make videos of your own. I really think this is something, productive to reflect on. Maybe in your case, it won't be comparing yourself to your own parents. Maybe it'll be comparing yourself to your boyfriend or your husband or what have you. But many of my viewers do have, their own YouTube channels. And I think it's worth pressing past the sort of shallow, immediate answer of, well, I'm somehow special. I'm somehow exceptional. Therefore, I put the pieces together and became vegan. All of us walk past the same spectacle of, dismembered animal corpses at the grocery store every day or at the market. We all see the animals going off to the slaughterhouse in the same trucks. We're all really presented with the same stimuli, The question is there to be asked, and it's well known. Most children ask these questions, whether it's about going fishing or hunting or just seeing a lobster being chopped up on a plate. I mean, sooner or later, it becomes self-evident to all of us in childhood or adulthood, this is a living animal being chopped up. And sooner or later, the other facts about ecology, economics, etc., also have to be raised. Not to mention, of course, health questions, blah, blah, blah. I think it's really important to discard the sense of our own specialness, to not regard ourselves as the exception, but to question why it is that the people we've known, deeply and over the long term, what is it about them that's exceptional, that lets them not see this, that lets them never acknowledge it or never respond to it, either with this inevitable, inexorable set of questions or this one simple answer, that this is an evil you can extricate yourself from, that this is an evil you don't have to compromise with.
À-bas-le-ciel.